Welcome back to the Formation Lap with Todd and Brad, regular guys talking elite racing. And we want to welcome you to the summer break. And we have a very special episode tonight and for the next couple of episodes, kind of a special series, I guess you will, beyond the checkered flag. And Todd and I are going to just share some things as we learn more about F1, some things that we've picked up on. And really excited to kind of do these little off episodes. Not really talking about specific races or whatever, but of course, we will be back to talking about our races in a few weeks when the summer break ends and we resume the Formula One calendar in Zandvoort. But Todd, I welcome you in here on our summer break as I'll let you introduce our Beyond the Checkered Flag episode for tonight.
Yeah, definitely so, Brad. I'm excited. I'm kind of bored. There's not a race going on. So, but I'm excited to talk about this. So, yeah, folks, what we wanted to talk about was, the quiet moments that win Formula One races. And it's beyond the checkered flag. And we're not going to talk about the silly season unless there's something that goes on. But we kind of wanted to give you a perspective of our perspective when we're watching a race. And so, welcome back. And as we do this, instead of talking about, the drivers and the rumors and, whatever, we're just going to ask you to look at it from our lens and watching a race and the excitement of turn one, when it's over, then what do we do? Right? And when the pit stops haven't yet started, some people get a little bit boring. They're like, okay, well, what's going on? Or those three are going to take off and run with it. And so the truth is, those might be the most important laps of the race before the first pit because there's a lot of strategy going on. And Brad and I are just going to talk about a little bit about it and go from there. And the leaders are not always racing flat out. And we've seen that in a couple of the races this year, that the pole didn't win. And so one thing that has surprised me that I started paying attention to more is, when that leaders, they're actually slowing the race down or they're slowing themselves down, might you say? They're managing engine temperatures, they're looking at the setup of the race because, qualifying might have been set up differently to get qualifying, but now the race, now they're trying to figure some things out. And you might hear them say, hey, are we going to go with plan A or plan B, or are we going to jump to plan C? And, they're trying to learn and do these things. We're not going to get in the technical piece, folks. And they're racing the clock too because they know they've got to do some adjustments or whatever. Not the car behind them, but they're really looking at, what is going to happen, in this first segment, might you say, until they get to the pit stop. So, Brad, as someone that follows the technical side more than I do, why doesn't the leader simply just push and just go, go, go?
Yeah, so a couple of things factor into that. Obviously, trying to manage their tires. Uh, we've seen just about every race this year. The leaders, and when I say the leaders, I'm talking about at least the top three or four. They usually start on mediums, and so obviously
Right.
depending on several factors. Obviously depending on the track. What kind of track is it? Is it a lot of flat out? Is it a lot of high speed corners? Is it low speed corners? What the weather's doing, the track temperature, what kind of degradation is factoring in. So, a lot of the reason, we see the guy, he wants to get on first, but, he's not necessarily improving his time. A big factor of that is wanting to save those tires. These guys are given a pit window by their race engineers. They said, your target lap is, between lap this and this, and that's what they're shooting for to pit. But they also have to be mindful that if they wear out those tires too easily, it could make them lose track position because they have to box early. They have to come into the pits early. It's also Todd, so much in Formula One is about track position,
Right.
and so if they push their tires too hard to where they're just done and they have not reached their target lap, which means later on in the race they've got to take an extra pit, they got to take an extra pit stop. That can put them at risk to get overtaken. So obviously the most straightforward answer in my opinion that I can think of is watching those tires, obviously brakes, you will sometimes engineer saying, hey,
Yeah.
let's pull back a little bit. We need to watch your brake temps. So that's a factor. Something that I absolutely love about Formula One, of course, we're in the heart of NASCAR country here. Obviously, IndyCar is big, but I love that these F1 cars they put them with fuel at the beginning of the
Yeah.
race, and that's what they. And we don't see fuel stops in F1. That's why the pit stops are anywhere from 2.5 to 3 seconds. So a lot of times at the beginning of the race, hey, it's let's get that fuel load down a little bit, and
Right.
those are just all at the top of my head. I know we're going to get into a little bit more of the pit strategy itself, but obviously just managing those tires and just trying to get a feel for how the race is going to play out. That's why the leaders they do push because they want to create a gap to make it a little bit easier in the pits, but they also don't want to just burn their race out and compromise their race for the rest of the laps and everything.
No, and you're spot on, Brad, because when you and I start watching and other fans, they get so, hey, he's in the front, he's going to win, and then next thing the guy behind him starts catching up, passing him, and whatever. And folks, if you've ever seen these steering wheels, I don't call them a steering wheel. I think they're a computer, right?
They're a mini computer. That's like right. They're very complicated.
They're pushing buttons, and the engineer's saying, "Hey, now, okay, we're going to do Plan A, and we're going to, go there." We'll talk about the plans later, but I think you're spot on, Brad. So, let's move to the other thing because as we look at it, folks, you see on the screen a lot of times that so and so is 1 point something seconds behind, or they're 2 seconds, or if they can get within a second, they might be able to use their overtake. But we're talking about tenths of seconds here,
Hmm.
right? And so, Brad, I know when we're watching it, we'll see sometimes 2.4 seconds, and it's 2.1, and it's 1.8, and you're like, you don't get to see it really on the TV.
Right.
You don't get to realize it, but 3/10 of every lap adds up fast. And so,
Yeah.
sometimes the entire strategy is because of these tiny gaps. And let's look at Austria, for example. Russell wasn't pulling away
Hmm.
and Max was slowly chipping away, right? And there were a few tenths kept pressure all afternoon. And Russell, of course, he was doing everything he could to win because he's like, I want to win another one. But those tenths start making you sweat.
Yeah.
And we see it on the screen. And if you're a fan of so and so or so and so, and you see somebody cutting in that, you're like, yes. But we know that the leader is also being fed that information, and you'll hear them
Right.
sometimes, how far is so and so behind me now? And knowing that I've got this curve or whatever. But those tents can keep pressure all weekend. So Brad, what are engineers really watching when those gaps start changing? What are they doing in the pit lane? But sometimes they're doing it back at the factory or whatever the strategy is. So what are they really looking for?
Yeah, so you bring up an interesting thing, and if you've seen the F1 movie, you got a taste of this that, yes, there's the engineers and the team principal on the pit wall. They're really looking at the data. There's also a whole team back at these team headquarters, they're looking at the data. They're communicating as well, saying, hey, this and this is going on, tell driver A, driver B, this is going on. So that's one factor. It's just not them
Right.
at the track. There's a whole lot of people watching, managing data, looking out. Yeah, Todd.
Crunching
So
data. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So you mentioned like we specifically saw in Austria where George Russell, and of course he went on to win that race. But Max and Kimmy were both making some strides there. They were, as you mentioned, cutting tenths away. Part of that is Max and Kimmy were on a little bit fresher of tires. Obviously, we just
Yeah.
mentioned that, so that comes into play. Also a big thing with these new cars is they can choose when they want to push and try to make up some time. It's just not all about this driver had just a little bit better of a lap, which we see that plenty of times. But sometimes it's
Right.
that, hey, I want to really start to chip away at that lead. I'm gonna use a little bit more of my battery to try to chip away to where I can get it within that 1 second. So I have overtake mode available. So we see that, and then Todd, I think a big thing that we really see this after the first pit stop, and depending on if a race is two pit stops or not, but we really see it in the last, I don't know, I'm going to say, 15 to 20 to 25 laps a race, these front leaders, and especially if, third and second is pushing for first, or, any
Right.
guys are pushing for the podium, we start see these guys coming across back markers. And what we mean by back markers, that can range from, P22 up to, I'm going to say, just on the conservative side, P10. And so,
Yeah.
some of that
Probably
is,
true.
I know there's been plenty of times as a McLaren fan, I see, and especially last year, I saw Lando and Oscar, and lap whatever of the race, we're in the final third of the race, they've got a really good lead, and all of a sudden, boom, they've lost a couple seconds because they're having to pass through those back markers. And so,
That's right.
there's a lot of factors that come in, but these guys are constantly being told data. I mean, I would encourage you, if you've never watched a race, we there's a really cool view of, just the cockpit view, and you don't necessarily get to hear the radio, but there is some options out there to watch the race, and getting to hear what the drivers hear. Man, they are fed so much
Oh,
data,
yes.
and they're having to think about so much. And Todd, you just mentioned the steering wheels, and it's a mini computer. There is
Yeah.
so many buttons, and it's the fuel mixture, it's the brake bias, it's the different modes we just mentioned, all the fact that they're having to upshift, downshift. I mean, these guys are intelligently, they have to be on their game to make it through. And then it's the fact of, you got to worry about passing, you got to worry about keeping someone behind you, and you have to hit your marks and your braking points for an upcoming corner.
Right.
So there is a lot to it, and I'm going to take a little step here, a little jab here, because F1 is the best motorsport out there. They're not just making left hand turns for 450 laps or whatever it is. There's a lot that goes into just one single lap, and even the ones
It
that are
is.
quote unquote not good drivers, they're still pretty talented.
Oh yeah, and fans. I mean, and what Brad's talking about is those not only physically but mentally they're getting wore out
Yeah.
to get the tenths of a second, and
Hmm.
trying to work through it, fed that information and things. And so the next time you watch it, just look at when you see a 2 second lead turn into 1.5.
Right.
You know that the driver behind has done some things to catch up, but the driver ahead is like, hey, we've got to save our tires or whatever. And so, the fuel or who knows, but we just want y'all to watch it that way as you go through, because they are all working it, and then the strategy sometimes changes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's talk about tire management, and we talked about it, but it wins races, and what I'm saying there is I didn't appreciate this until I've watched F1 more, is that you'll see before the race, hey, this is the Pirelli is sending these type of tires, and here's the strategy, and so forth. Oh yeah, let's put on the soft tires. Well, that's only going to work for a little bit, and the fastest driver early in the stint sometimes becomes the slowest driver. And that strategy is something that is amazing when you think about it. And we talked about the overheating and the whatever, but let's look at a race that was exciting about this, and it was Barcelona.
Hmm.
And Brad, you and I saw it, and we're like, what? Ferrari's on softs? And folks, that means that tire is going to wear out faster, but it's also got a lot of grip fast. And the other ones I think were on mediums, right? And so they had sat back in a room the week before the race and said, "This is what we're going to do." Now, of course, they practiced, right? They did some qualifying. They tested their strategy out, but they went into that race saying that we're going to go with a three-stop strategy, and they didn't dominate every lap. And if you
No.
noticed, it was like, wow. But what Ferrari continued to do, and folks, they knew it was, and you would hear them say, "Are we going to stay on plan A?" or whatever it was. And this is what they had already thought about. All the data that we just talked about was coming back in. And then when the VSC came out, virtual safety car, that came out a little early. And let me tell you, Ferrari was ready to jump on
Hmm.
it. And it happened at the perfect time. A lot of people say, well, luck. But guess what? There's other times it's going to happen. But it was one before the virtual safety car came out.
That's
And
right.
that's what I
Yeah.
want people to look at. as they look at this strategy, and the drivers had to be about it, the pit wall had to be about it, the people at the factory, and they couldn't variate much, but they could have said, let's go to plan B. But Brad, explain why teams sometimes sacrifice those tenths or those laps earlier in the race, like we saw at Barcelona with Lewis, because Lewis ended up winning this thing.
Yeah, great question, Todd. I love it. I'm sure that you've heard, no matter what, who you watch on F1, you need to talk about them. Are they going to undercut? Are they going to stay out? Undercutting is simply about getting track position, right? We hear that, these guys lose, on an average for a pit stop, it's about 22 seconds. And that's from entering the pit lane to making the stop itself. And, we're assuming a pit stop is anywhere from 2.5 to 3 seconds and then exiting the pit lane. So altogether, that is about 22 seconds. That obviously varies by track. Some pit lanes are a little bit shorter, some longer. But
Right.
Todd, you mentioned Barcelona was a track that Lewis and Ferrari decided to undercut the Mercedes, and it was all about track position. They decided, hey, we're going to start on the quicker tire. We know they're going to degrade quicker, but and you said Ferrari did get a little bit they got fortunate at times because of the safety car and folks, that's another thing to point out. When you have a virtual safety car or a safety car and you're allowed to pit, that basically cuts your lost pit stop time in half. It takes it down to about anywhere from 10 to 12 seconds. So that is very, very beneficial if you can
Yeah.
pit under a safety car and have track position. But yeah, Lewis is a perfect example there in Barcelona. He chose to undercut Kimi and George. He had track position, ended up getting on fresher tires, and what did we see? Lewis was just putting up
Oh, he was
amazing lap times.
flying.
And Todd, I believe he was up by what, about 16 or 17 seconds, kind of at the end of the race there. I
Yeah.
mean, it was just crazy. So that's a big part of tire strategy that these engineers and the team principals talk about. And we don't know what plan A, plan B, plan C is.
Yeah.
That
You
could mean a
don't.
that can mean a one stop, that can mean a two stop. Sometimes it's a dummy call. It sometimes, because look,
Exactly.
these teams, they're listening to each other's radio, so are they have access at least. So sometimes it's a dummy call saying, hey, George, Lewis, Kimmy, we're going to say, we're on plan C. Plan C doesn't mean anything. We know what the real strategy is. We're just trying to throw the other teams off. So
Right.
that's part of
Right.
that. Todd, another big thing with undercutting it and staying out is, we hear some tracks are very beneficial because it's all about track position, and that's why teams decide to come in earlier and pit. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's, hey, let's push these tires as far as they can go. And let's just let's get on fresh tires when they matter. Something
Right.
else, just two more points about kind of tires. So much, and you haven't heard as much this year with these new cars, but you hear the announcer say, well, this driver is in the dirty air, and all that means
Yeah.
is, obviously these cars are punching a hole through the air. And if a car is falling close behind, if a driver is close behind and he simply can't get behind, he's getting all that dirty air, and it's chewing up his tires. And we saw it a lot more last year and the previous years in the ground effect era, to where these guys really, if they were behind the car for more than two laps, their tires were just toast. And that is
Yeah.
one thing that I think, yes, it's still a balancing act, and these new cars do need some improvements. But one thing I do like is these guys can stay behind the car for more laps and try
Yeah,
to
they
be
can.
competitive. And that's simply because of the aerodynamic changes that have been made. But dirty air is so much of a factor. We hear engineers tell guys all the time, hey, you need to get by this guy as quick as possible so your tires don't just completely
That's right.
fall off the cliff.
That's
And
right.
so dirty air is one thing. Watch the second half of the season and really listen for that, saying, especially the commentators will say, well, this driver's in this guy's dirty air, therefore he has to, he may be within 7/10 of a second, 6/10 of a second, but then you see the next lap, he ends up being more than a second. It's because those
Exactly.
those tires are becoming over here. So dirty air, like I said, it's not something we've heard as much this year, but it's still very, very relevant in races.
Yeah. Yeah. And Brad, you're right, because you'll see it on uh, two or three laps. They're fighting each other. And then when the guy behind him finally passes, he gets out 2 seconds ahead by the time at the next race. So, let's talk about that, the pit window and folks, too, and we've explained it a little bit, but, if the tires aren't working right but your competitor is going to try to undercut you or what we said or virtual safety car, everybody has to slow down, and then if you can get in and do it, then, get your tires changed, it helps. And, that was a light bulb because I was like, when's he going to pit? Everybody else is pitting at lap 12. That's when it gets exciting, and you can't figure out who's going to be in first or second, and Lewis and, your team comes out, eighth now. And wait a minute, how did he get way back there? And knowing that they've already figured out that so and so is going to have to pit next. But let's look at Belgium and Hungary, for example. Belgium, Kimi and Leclerc, and they were at it, and the
Hmm.
VSC came out, right? But everything looked like it was going to change during the stop. The Ferrari fans like, yay, but Kimi and the Mercedes had already positioned themselves perfectly before that because they had stretched that time
Right.
so far. And folks, what we mean by that, just look at the little, you know, screen graphics when you watch a race next time, you'll see that he had just enough that he was going to be able to pull this out. Now, if he had gone a little slower or if the back marker had gotten away, there was a lot of what ifs. That was
Hmm.
one. And then Hungary, just the last race with your guy winning, Lando, right? Lando wasn't just driving quickly, he was constantly, projecting his options and he was also protecting them. And
Hmm.
and he knew about it, and that gave Lando a great. He was fast. Don't get me wrong, right? But
Yeah.
he was playing that. They were talking through it and say, "Okay, you've got to protect this. Okay, now you can go a little faster." And we heard the technician guy say, "You can slow down now a little bit,
Hmm.
Lando." But he was like, "No, I want to make sure that I win it." And you know, folks, that's what this pit window is so exciting. And if you get three stops, you're going to have to be really fast
Yeah.
in many
Yeah.
places. Two, and we've seen it and done just one stop, and that's a gamble, but it happens, especially like Monaco and stuff where they don't burn it. But Brad, talk us through why teams sometimes wait another lap or two laps, and everybody's going everybody's pitting. Why isn't he pitting? Just a little more explanation on that.
Yeah, another great question. So, couple of things that just come to mind, and just my takeaway, and what I kind of watch one races. One is these engineers, Todd. Um, you know, I know 2 laps as a tire offset doesn't sound like a whole lot, but at the end of the race, it can be a whole lot. If you're on tires that are just simply 2 or 3 laps fresher than a guy that you're chasing, that's a really that can be a really big deal. And once again, these guys, I mean, we're talking these courses are, 1 lap is a few miles long, a couple kilometers long, whatever, wherever you're listening from, so that can, just those can be a big deal. Another thing, and you mentioned Lando last time in Hungary. He had a great race. I want to talk about Oscar real quick, kind of with this question, because
Yeah,
we saw Oscar last
that's
time, and
right.
you kind of saw the internal battle in McLaren a little bit. Oscar was in first, Lando was in second. Well, guess what? Oscar gets choice of when he wants to pit. Oscar decided to pit first, therefore he was in the lead. But one thing we saw is um, that Oscar was going back and forth with his race engineer about is when they pitted Oscar, Oscar was therefore caught behind some of those back markers. And what did we
Yeah,
see? He made contact with Carlos Sainz. It was really unfortunate. We heard that the system was down that alerts these guys when there is a lead car behind them, and it ruined Oscar's race. So.
right.
Sometimes these guys, sometimes they want to come in, and you'll hear them during that pit window. It's like, okay, what kind of traffic am I going to come out in? Because Todd, even though these guys are on newer tires, and even if those, a guy that was in first or second, he could come out in seventh or eighth, and those guys that are in seventh or eighth, they know that that is not their race. You hear all the time these commentators
Yeah,
say, "Well, they're not racing this and this, their races with someone else." And so these guys on fresher tires, they know that they know that they're going to make a quick pass. But the bottom line is, if they're not able to, that's valuable time that they're losing. And guess what? It's burning up those fresh tires, and it could see them fall off a cliff later on in the race, or it's giving their competitors a chance to catch back up. So these
Yeah,
engineers, that to me would be very, very tough. Is do we decide to pit this lap, or and risk maybe running into a little traffic, but we could get undercut, or do we wait a couple more laps, and try to get try to push try to push those tires
that's right.
even more so. Man, it's tough being a driver. I can't imagine being a race engineer though. That's got to be just so
It
difficult.
is, Brad. And you see what I think it's five or six that are there on pit lane looking at all these. Let's look at Silverstone, for example, with Ferrari. Ferrari had Charles and Lewis, but they were two different races, right? And of course, everybody wanted Charles and Lewis to be the top, and they wanted Lewis to win, because of a lot of reasons. But let's look at it. They were different races, they were different traffic, they were different outcomes, right? And of course, there were some car issues that Lewis had, but it was because of where Lewis was in the race and his pit stops that got him into those back markers and whatever. And those little details changed everything, even though he was trying to get back, but Charles had got so far out, in front. And so what we talked about, with dirty air and, passing those back markers and the temp, I mean, it showed, and Lewis wanted to win so bad. But, so as we close up, Brad, folks, if y'all will do this, we really want you to, and this is the reason why we want to do this episode. The next time you watch a F1 race, watch for the gaps, watch for those lap times up in the top right hand corner or whatever it is. Watch who's catching traffic ahead, and then watch who is quietly setting up something, with tents to go, because the biggest moves often happen long before they enter the pits and the quiet time. So, Brad, thanks for spending a few minutes to talk about this, and
Absolutely.
we'll close it out.
Yeah. So next week, kind of, part two of this, we're going to continue this beyond the checkered flag, and I want to say Todd and I are not experts, but we've watched enough F1 races that we kind of know what to look for. And it's cool when you are just not simply wanting to see, 100 passes during a race. We want to help you start watching a race like you're on the pit wall. And so we're going to give you some clues of what to watch, when it's going to happen, what's going to happen. And obviously there's always unknowns in F1 that you can just never predict, but just some tells, just some indications of what's going to happen. That's going to be on our next episode of Beyond the Checker Flag. We'll talk about that, but we appreciate your continued support. Please give this video a like. Comment on what you see during a race. I'm sure some of our listeners know a lot more than us, and you may see things totally different. And another thing that we didn't mention is, if maybe your favorite team or your favorite driver is one of those midfield teams, you're looking at a whole different race than someone that's
Yeah.
supporting a guy that's always in the lead. So it's always fascinating. It's always so much fun. But we appreciate the support. Please give the Formation Lap a follow. Hit that subscribe button. We appreciate. Like I said, we're going to continue to bring you a couple more Beyond the Checker Flag episodes during the summer break, and we are really, really excited for racing later on this month in August back at Zandvoort when the second half of the 2026 season gets underway. But thank you for tuning in. This is Todd and Brad, regular guys talking elite racing. We will see you next time. Thanks, and have a good day.